Keith, if you would, could you tell us what cloud computing means to you?
Yeah, I don't think that Allison really was that far off. Cloud computing is, to me and to everything that I've been able to see, is just a marketing term for the way we've been doing business for probably the last decade. The idea that you're migrating your information from being locally stored to being remotely stored for a variety of reasons, cost, access, and that's just the natural evolution of computers that we're seeing. It's the type of thing that I was just saying before that, people don't recognize technology until Apple puts a cool name on it. MP3 players are around, nobody cared until it was called an iPod. They stick an I in front of cloud, now all of a sudden cloud computing is the hot thing. But it's something that we've all been dealing with for the longest time. Before I was with T-Mobile, I did a lot of complex litigation as outside counsel. I worked on the tobacco litigation going back to the late 90s. And even back then, we had a depository of documents with the state of Minnesota that everybody was able to access, and that was cloud computing as much as anything is today. So it's really not one thing in particular so much as the way in which the world is going to be operating going forward.
So Keith, or any of the panelists, why do we want to do cloud computing? What are the advantages of cloud computing?
Well, I mean, the advantages are cost. You're not paying for the server space. Security, to the extent that you're relying on another company to protect it. Most importantly is convenience and accessibility. Having something in sort of the Ethernet, as was described before, allows it to be accessed from any computer terminal. And each of those advantages has distinct disadvantages that everybody needs to be careful of. Now, for the people in this room, for litigators, for attorneys, each of those advantages and disadvantages have significant obligations that I'm not sure that any of us, and at least certainly I didn't appreciate until I started working on this, as to discovery, as well as litigation tactics and ways in which you can use the remote storage of information to your client's advantage and to protect them from potentially bad things that when the other side has this type of knowledge.
And when you're thinking about the pros and cons, I also think you need to go back to that nebulous definition of the cloud. Because I think what we're learning from all of this is that the cloud, there's no consensus on what the cloud is. The cloud is perhaps keeping your stuff someplace else. And keeping your stuff someplace else could mean backing up your company's data in a secure piece of hardware that's in a locker in a data center where you have the key and you have complete control over that. And that's the old days of what we did, what we call disaster recovery. And it's evolved to the point where now you have these virtual locations that have shared architecture and shared applications that you can use and real-time hosting of your applications and your services. And there's every variation that you could possibly imagine today available to you. So are you working in a shared architecture situation? Are you working in a single architecture situation? That defines how secure your data is. That defines information about what the extent of some of these risks, the benefits of some of the risks, and some of the considerations that you need to follow down the line in terms of how you access that information in ways that you weren't contemplating when you set up that cloud relationship.
So Mo, you've started to touch actually on some of the risks and cons associated with cloud computing, and your company is one of the worldwide leaders in this area of data security. How does the fact that information is stored remotely at another location, what are the security implications of that?
Well, it's double-edged, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's a security benefit for some businesses, right? If you're not in the business of securing IT, then you'd be better off putting your IT in the hands of an entity that is sophisticated at protecting that information. The other side of that is that when you have information stored in a place where people know where it is, they're going to go and try to get it, right? Hackers are going to see that source, and so there are all sorts of data security protocols that need to be put into place. And as a consumer of cloud services, you need to be asking those questions. How secure do I need my data to be? What are the protocols that are in place to protect my data when it's there?
One of the simple ways I've thought about this from a litigation standpoint, what the changes we've seen over the last 15 years are, it used to be the documents that the client had were boxes of paper in warehouses. Then they became e-files, millions of pages of e-documents but they were on computers that were at your client's office. They were under your client's control. Now, they're all e-files, e-documents, millions of pages, but they're no longer at the client's office. They are in a third party's control. And that's got a lot of implications for litigation. And so we've put up some points here on the potential cons of cloud issues. We've talked about loss of physical control, security issues, multiple providers. Keith, I don't know if you have anything, any thoughts on some of these issues.
Well, I think one of the biggest is not, as an attorney for your company and as an outside counsel, there are implications to having somebody else have actual custody of those documents. One of the reasons you use an outside firm to store documents, to host the documents, is that they've got hopefully certain redundancies in place that protect the data. You're not just worried about protecting an environment physically, but also in case it gets erased, that you've got it somewhere else, that you've got continual backups. Well, as an attorney getting a discovery request, you have to find responsive documents. You go to your company that hosts these documents. You run your searches. But if you've got a backup policy that backs up, you know, your email data for 30 days, and then you write over it, well, what's your hosting company's, what are their policies with regard to redundancies and backing up data? Do they have more? Do they keep it for 60 days or 90 days? In which case, is that your obligation to not only look at what you're asking them to host, but what of your documents they may also have that go beyond what you normally would have in your document retention policy? And these are questions that you have to ask in order to be responsible in responding to discovery. You know, that's also a two-edged sword because on one hand, you may only want to keep documents for 30 days. And if you've got some company out there who's holding your documents for 60 or 90 days in violation of that policy, it's inconsistencies and it may be something you don't want to do that you need to address with the company.